Have you ever walked away from a conversation smiling on the outside, while something inside you was quietly collapsing? Maybe someone interrupted you in the middle of a meeting like your words carried no weight. Maybe a friend made a joke at your expense and everyone laughed while you forced yourself to laugh too. Maybe someone you loved dismissed your feelings so casually that it made you question your own value. Or maybe it was worse. Maybe someone humiliated you publicly, and the room went silent while you stood there pretending it did not hurt. And then later, when nobody was around, the scene replayed in your mind again and again, like a movie you never wanted to watch in the first place. You thought about what you should have said, what you wish you had done, the perfect comeback that arrived 2 hours too late, the anger, the embarrassment, the helplessness. It stayed there, buried beneath your skin, long after the moment ended. Now let me ask you something. How many moments like that have shaped your life without you even realizing it? How many times have you slowly handed away your confidence because of the careless words of other people? Most people think disrespect is just an unpleasant experience. The Stoics believed it was something far more dangerous. They believed the way you respond to disrespect determines the structure of your entire character. Not the insult itself. Not the person delivering it. Your response. That single moment where your emotions rise like fire in your chest and you choose, consciously or unconsciously, whether you will master yourself or surrender yourself. And that choice changes everything. Because here is the truth nobody says out loud. Most people are not destroyed by failure. They are destroyed by emotional bleeding. Tiny cuts repeated over years. A sarcastic comment here. A humiliation there. A dismissive look. A betrayal. A rejection. One after another until eventually they become cautious, reactive, defensive people who move through life expecting pain from every direction. You see it everywhere. People terrified to speak up because they were mocked once years ago. People shrinking themselves in relationships because someone made them feel small. People abandoning dreams because criticism hurt more than they admitted. And maybe, if we are being honest, part of you recognizes yourself in that. That is exactly why this conversation matters. Because over 2,000 years ago, long before modern psychology existed, the Stoics discovered something extraordinary. They discovered that a human being could become emotionally unbreakable. Not cold. Not emotionless. Not detached from life. But internally sovereign. They believed the mind, properly trained, could become untouchable by external chaos. Imagine that for a second. Imagine walking into a room where people doubt you, criticize you, underestimate you, and none of it controls your inner state anymore. Imagine hearing an insult without feeling your confidence collapse. Imagine rejection without self-hatred. Imagine disappointment without emotional destruction. That was the Stoic ideal. And before you dismiss that as ancient philosophy disconnected from modern life, understand who these people actually were. Marcus Aurelius was not sitting peacefully on a mountain meditating about positivity. He was ruling the most powerful empire on earth while dealing with war, plague, betrayal, political corruption, and constant pressure. He wrote his reflections in military camps surrounded by death and uncertainty. Epictetus was born a slave. He was physically tortured by his master. He understood humiliation more deeply than most people ever will. And yet, he became one of the most respected philosophical teachers in history. Seneca was one of the richest men in Rome and later sentenced to death by the emperor he once advised. Zeno of Citium lost everything he owned in a shipwreck before building the philosophy that would survive empires. These were not men speaking from comfort. These were people forged by suffering. And what they discovered was simple but life-changing. Nothing outside of you has the power to define you unless you allow it to enter your mind and take control there. That is the foundation of everything we are about to explore. Not shallow motivation. Not empty self-help slogans. Not social media positivity. Real psychological strength. The kind that changes how you carry yourself. The kind people can feel when you walk into a room. The kind that makes you difficult to manipulate, difficult to intimidate, difficult to break. Because there is a certain kind of person you have probably encountered once or twice in your life. You know exactly the kind I mean. Someone insults them, and they do not flinch. Someone tries to provoke them, and they stay calm. Someone attacks them emotionally, and somehow they remain grounded, not passive, not weak, just completely centered. And strangely, that calmness becomes power. The person attacking them starts to look unstable while they look composed. The aggressor loses control while the calm person gains it. That energy is not accidental. It is trained. And over the next principles, you are going to understand exactly how that transformation happens. But before we even get into the first rule, I need you to understand what begins to change when these ideas stop being theory and start becoming part of your nervous system. The first thing that happens is you stop bleeding emotionally. Right now, many people are carrying years of invisible emotional injuries. Small humiliations that never healed. Rejections they pretended not to care about. Criticism they laughed off publicly while secretly replaying it at night. The sarcastic coworker. The dismissive boss. The friend who always subtly undermines you. The relationship where you never felt fully respected. Every one of those moments costs energy. It costs confidence. It costs focus. It costs emotional freedom. And most people never realize how exhausted they are because they have been carrying all of it for so long. But once you begin applying Stoic principles, something incredible happens. You stop giving people unrestricted access to your inner world. Not because you become numb, because you become aware. You begin recognizing that someone else's disrespect says far more about their internal state than your worth. Think about it honestly. When people are deeply secure, deeply fulfilled, deeply at peace with themselves, do they spend their time humiliating others? Rarely. Most cruelty comes from insecurity. Most arrogance comes from fear. Most disrespect comes from internal weakness trying to disguise itself as power. The Stoics understood this clearly. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people behave badly because they do not understand good from evil. In other words, their actions reveal their confusion, not your value. That shift alone changes everything, because the moment you stop interpreting every insult as proof that something is wrong with you, you reclaim your power. And then something even more important begins to happen. You become difficult to provoke. Not fake tough. Not emotionally shut down. Not pretending not to care while secretly boiling inside. Actually stable. There is a massive difference. Fake toughness is loud. Real strength is quiet. Fake toughness reacts immediately. Real strength pauses. And that pause is one of the most powerful skills you will ever develop. Because when somebody insults you, your biology reacts before your logic does. Your heart rate rises. Your muscles tighten. Your nervous system prepares for threat. Neuroscientists call this an amygdala hijack. Your emotional brain takes over before your rational brain fully catches up. That is why people say things they regret. Why arguments escalate. Why relationships collapse in seconds. But the Stoics train themselves to create space between stimulus and response. A breath. A pause. A moment of awareness. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, later described this idea perfectly. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and power to choose. That space is where your character lives. Most people never develop it. They react instantly. Emotion controls them. External events dictate their inner state. But once you strengthen that space, your entire life changes. You begin choosing responses instead of acting from impulse. And people notice. Calmness under pressure has always commanded respect. Think about the leaders, athletes, military commanders, or mentors you admire most. They rarely panic. They rarely explode emotionally. There is something grounded about them even in chaos. That grounded energy creates authority. Because emotional control is power. And there is another layer to this that most people never consider. Every time you react emotionally to disrespect, you hand control of your nervous system to another person. Read that again carefully. If someone can insult you and instantly ruin your peace, They are controlling your emotional state. The Stoics refuse to live that way. They believe freedom began internally, not financial freedom, not political freedom, psychological freedom, the ability to remain internally stable regardless of external circumstances. That is what made them formidable. And over time, as you practice these ideas, your entire relationship with conflict changes. Instead of immediately defending yourself, you begin observing. Instead of personalizing everything, you begin analyzing. Instead of collapsing emotionally, you begin staying centered. You stop acting like a target. You start acting like an observer. And observers see clearly. That clarity changes your decisions, your relationships, your confidence, your posture, even the way people treat you. Because the world responds differently to people who respect themselves deeply. Not arrogant people, not aggressive people, grounded people. The kind of people who no longer need constant approval because their identity is no longer built on external validation. That is where real confidence comes from. Not compliments, not status, not popularity. Internal alignment, knowing who you are independent of how people treat you. And let me tell you something important. This does not happen overnight. Nobody listens to one philosophy video and suddenly becomes emotionally invincible. Marcus Aurelius still struggled. Seneca still struggled. Epictetus still struggled. Stoicism was never about perfection. It was about practice, daily practice, consistent awareness, repeated self-correction, brick by brick. That is how emotional resilience is built. The same way a fortress is built. Not instantly. Slowly, deliberately, through repetition. And every single difficult moment becomes training. Every insult becomes practice. Every criticism becomes practice. Every humiliation becomes practice. The person who hurt you unknowingly becomes part of your training ground. That is the Stoic reversal. What was supposed to weaken you becomes material that strengthens you. And eventually, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing disrespect, because you realize it cannot truly damage you unless you cooperate with it internally. That realization is freedom. Real freedom. The kind that allows you to walk through life without constantly needing validation from everyone around you. The kind that lets you stay calm while others lose themselves emotionally. The kind that transforms pain into wisdom instead of bitterness. And if you stay with me through these principles, not just hearing them but genuinely applying them, you are going to notice something changing inside you. The emotional bleeding slows down. The reactions become smaller. The recovery becomes faster. The confidence becomes quieter but stronger. Until eventually you become the kind of person who no longer breaks under disrespect. Not because life became easier, because you became stronger. And that changes everything. And that is where everything begins to change. Because once you stop bleeding emotionally every time someone disrespects you, something unexpected happens. The people trying to provoke you begin walking away feeling weaker, while you walk away stronger. That becomes your power. And then comes the third transformation. You start making better decisions. At first, this might sound unrelated, but it is deeply connected. Modern neuroscience has made this incredibly clear. When a person becomes emotionally reactive, especially during moments of disrespect or humiliation, the brain literally loses access to its highest level thinking. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term thinking, emotional regulation, strategic judgment, and self-control, begins shutting down under emotional flooding. In simple terms, when your emotions explode, your intelligence temporarily shrinks. That is why people send messages they regret, why they ruin relationships in moments of anger, why they sabotage careers with emotional reactions, why one insult can destroy an entire day. Emotion narrows perspective. But when you master your response to disrespect, something remarkable happens neurologically. You do not just become calmer. You become mentally sharper, more rational, more strategic. You begin seeing the full picture instead of reacting to one emotional moment. And that changes the quality of your entire life. But perhaps the biggest shift of all is this. People begin treating you differently. Not because you suddenly become aggressive. Not because you start dominating rooms. Not because you become loud or intimidating. The opposite. There is simply something unmistakable about a person who cannot easily be shaken. Something grounded. Something calm. Something magnetic. You have probably felt it before around certain people. They enter a room quietly, but the energy changes anyway. Nobody needs to announce their confidence because it radiates naturally through their composure. People speak differently around them. People think more carefully before insulting them. People instinctively respect them. Why? Because across every culture in human history, human beings have always recognized one thing immediately. A person who has mastered themselves. And that brings us to the first rule. Understand this deeply. Disrespect is almost never about you. In the winter of 177 AD, one of the most shocking betrayals in Roman history unfolded. A Roman general named Avidius Cassius, one of Emperor Marcus Aurelius' most trusted commanders, spread a rumor across the empire that Marcus had died. Then he declared himself emperor. Imagine that for a moment. A man Marcus had elevated personally. A man he trusted. A man he respected. Suddenly turning against him publicly in an act of betrayal and humiliation. Cassius marched toward Rome with his legions. He positioned himself as the new ruler before Marcus was even gone. Most people would have exploded with rage. Most people would have obsessed over revenge, public humiliation, punishment, hatred. But Marcus Aurelius responded differently. In his private journal, the writings we now call Meditations, he wrote something extraordinary. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, "Today I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, the antisocial." All these things happen because they do not understand good from evil. Notice what he did not write. He did not write about destroying his enemies. He did not write about revenge. He did not write about humiliation. Instead, he wrote something radically calm. These people act this way because they do not know any better. That single idea contains enormous psychological power, because Marcus understood something most people never fully realize. Human behavior is always revealing the internal condition of the person behaving that way. The Stoics called this universal causation, the idea that every human action comes from a combination of conditioning, fears, wounds, beliefs, insecurities, limitations, and emotional states. In other words, when someone disrespects you, they are showing you themselves, not defining you. And this is not soft philosophy. This is practical reality. Think honestly about the last time you acted cruelly towards someone. Not your best moment. Not the polished version of yourself. The real moment. Why did it happen? Were you exhausted? Stressed? Threatened? Insecure? Overwhelmed? Dealing with something painful internally? Most likely, yes. Your behavior in that moment was a projection of your internal state. It had far less to do with the other person than you would probably like to admit. The same is true for the people who disrespect you. A rude person often carries internal chaos. An arrogant person often hides insecurity. A cruel person is often deeply wounded. A person obsessed with humiliating others usually fears humiliation themselves. Strong people rarely need to make others feel small. And once you truly understand this, insults begin losing their emotional poison. Because you stop seeing disrespect as a final verdict about your worth. You start seeing it as information about the emotional state of the other person. That shift creates freedom. There is an ancient story about Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, that captures this perfectly. Before becoming a philosopher, Zeno was a wealthy merchant. He had ships, cargo, money, status, and success. Then one day, everything disappeared. A shipwreck destroyed his entire fortune. In a single moment, he lost his wealth, his business, and the identity he had built around material success. Most people would have collapsed emotionally. Most people would have interpreted the loss as proof they were ruined. But Zeno did something different. After washing ashore in Athens with nothing left, he wandered into a small bookshop. There he picked up a copy of Xenophon writings about Socrates. He stood there reading for hours, completely broke, completely unknown. standing in the ruins of his former life. Then he asked the bookseller a question. "Where can I find a man like Socrates?" The bookseller pointed toward a philosopher named Crates walking nearby. Zeno followed him, studied under him, rebuilt himself from the inside out, and from the destruction of his old life, he created a philosophy that would outlive empires. Now think carefully about what happened psychologically. Zeno lost everything externally, but he refused to interpret that loss as a statement about his value. That distinction matters enormously. The shipwreck was a circumstance, not an identity. The loss was external, not internal. And the same principle applies every time someone disrespects you. When someone mocks you, ignores you, talks over you, dismisses your ideas, or tries to make you feel small, that moment is a circumstance. External, temporary, neutral until interpreted. And whether it actually defines you is entirely up to how you respond afterward. Most people react immediately. They defend themselves emotionally. They argue. They panic internally. They chase approval. They replay the moment endlessly. But the Stoics believed your real answer should never be given through emotional reaction. It should be given through your life. Not through louder words. Through stronger character. Because at the end of the day, someone can insult your intelligence, but they cannot actually make you unintelligent. Someone can mock your ambition, but they cannot remove your potential. Someone can disrespect you publicly, but they cannot touch your integrity unless you surrender it yourself. And once you truly understand that, something powerful begins happening internally. You stop trying to win every emotional battle. You stop desperately needing everyone to validate your worth. You stop collapsing every time another human being projects their pain onto you. Instead, you become calmer, more observant, more difficult to destabilize. And ironically, that calmness becomes strength. Because people can feel when someone no longer depends on external approval to feel valuable. That energy changes everything. It changes your posture, your voice, your decisions, your relationships, your presence. And slowly, almost invisibly, you become the kind of person the Stoics were trying to create all along. Not perfect, not emotionless, not invulnerable, but internally sovereign. A person who understands that disrespect from others only becomes destruction when it is accepted internally as truth. And this is where Stoicism becomes something far deeper than emotional control. It becomes identity. Because the moment you truly know who you are internally, other people lose the power to define you externally. The Stoic insight is simple, but incredibly difficult to live. A person who fully understands themselves cannot truly be insulted. Not intellectually, not theoretically, deeply, because every insult only survives inside the gap between what another person says about you and what you secretly fear might already be true. That is where insults live. In uncertainty, in insecurity, in unresolved self-doubt. Close that gap, and suddenly the insult has nowhere to land. Think about it carefully. If someone walks up to a professional musician and says, "You do not know how to play music," the musician does not collapse emotionally. Why? Because they already know the truth about themselves. But if someone criticizes an insecurity you secretly fear might be real, the emotional reaction becomes explosive. That is why Stoicism places such enormous importance on self-examination. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. For more than 2 decades, he practiced daily written reflection. Every morning and night, he examined his own character relentlessly. His fears, his weaknesses, his impulses, his failures, his responsibilities, not to punish himself, not to become emotionally numb, but to become clear. And clarity creates stability. So when Avidius Cassius betrayed him publicly, yes, Marcus felt the sting of it. He was still human. Stoicism never meant becoming emotionless. But the betrayal did not destroy him. It did not crack his foundation. Because his foundation was not built on popularity, approval, loyalty, or public admiration. It was built internally on character. And nobody else's betrayal could reach that place. That is what real strength looks like. Not the absence of pain, the absence of collapse. The next time someone disrespects you, I want you to pause before reacting and ask yourself one question. What must be happening inside this person's life, fears, insecurities, or history for them to behave this way? Notice, this question changes everything instantly. You are no longer emotionally trapped inside the insult itself. You are now observing the source of it, and observers suffer differently than targets do. You do not even need to forgive the person immediately. You do not need to excuse their behavior. You do not need to become passive. Just ask the question, because the moment curiosity enters your mind, emotional chaos begins leaving it. That is the shift, and it leads directly into the second rule. Master the pause. The most powerful weapon you possess is not aggression. It is not dominance. It is not having the perfect comeback. It is the ability to pause. In 65 AD, Emperor Nero, increasingly paranoid and unstable, sent a message to his former tutor, the Stoic philosopher Seneca. The message was brutally simple. You are ordered to take your own life. Imagine receiving that sentence. Seneca was 70 years old, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Rome. A philosopher who had spent decades writing about courage, discipline, mortality, and emotional mastery, and now life demanded proof. Most people imagine philosophy as something abstract until reality arrives with a knife in its hand. This was Seneca's moment, and what he did next became one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of Stoic composure in history. He did not panic. He did not beg. He did not scream in rage. He did not attempt to escape. Instead, he gathered his friends calmly around him. He spoke gently to his wife Pompeia Paulina, who insisted on dying beside him. And according to the Roman historian Tacitus, Seneca said something remarkable. What has become of all our philosophy? What has become of the lessons we studied for so many years against misfortune? That sentence matters enormously, because in that moment, Seneca understood something most people never understand until it is too late. Character is built before the crisis arrives, not during it. The pause was already trained into him long before Nero's message ever appeared. So he paused. He chose his response deliberately. And then, with complete composure, he opened his veins and continued dictating philosophical reflections to his secretaries as he died. Now obviously, Stoicism is not asking you to face disrespect with that level of extreme composure. The point is something deeper. The space between what happens to you and how you respond is where your character actually lives, not in your intentions, not in your self-image, not in your motivational quotes. In the pause, Seneca's final act was the ultimate demonstration of that principle. Even death itself was not allowed to force an unconscious reaction from him. And for most of us, the pause appears in much smaller moments. A manager criticizes you publicly during a meeting. Everyone looks at you. You feel your face heat up instantly. Your jaw tightens. Your stomach drops. Inside your body, chemistry explodes before thought even begins. Cortisol floods your system. Adrenaline rises. Your nervous system prepares for conflict. And suddenly the urge appears automatically. Defend yourself. Attack back. Shut down emotionally. Prove them wrong immediately. That reaction is not weakness. It is biology. Neuroscientists call this an amygdala hijack. The amygdala, the brain alarm system, activates faster than rational thought. It was designed for survival thousands of years ago. The problem is that modern emotional conflict activates the same ancient survival mechanisms. Your brain reacts to embarrassment almost like physical danger. That is why people say things they regret within seconds. Why relationships fracture instantly. Why careers collapse over emotional reactions. Why one moment of anger can create years of damage. The pause interrupts all of that. The pause is a conscious breath inserted between stimulus and reaction. Sometimes it is only 3 seconds. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is simply refusing to respond immediately. But those few seconds are life-changing, because within them, your rational mind returns online. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, described it perfectly. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and within that space lies your freedom. Think about how powerful that really is. Someone insults you. There is a space. Someone humiliates you publicly. There is a space. Someone dismisses your worth. There is a space. Most people never notice it because their reactions are automatic. But Stoicism trains you to see the space. And once you see it, you can begin choosing instead of merely reacting. That is where real power begins. Not in controlling other people. In controlling your response. Because the person who instantly reacts emotionally is predictable. Easy to manipulate. Easy to provoke. But the person who pauses becomes difficult to control. And people feel that immediately. There is something deeply unsettling about someone who refuses to react impulsively. It changes the emotional balance of the interaction instantly. The person trying to provoke you expects emotional chaos. They expect anger, defensiveness, emotional leakage. When none arrives, they lose momentum, and you gain clarity. This is why the pause is not passive. It is strategic. It gives you access to wisdom instead of impulse, choice instead of reason, strength instead of emotional silence. And like every Stoic practice, it starts small. A breath before replying, a moment of silence, a decision to wait before saying the message, a refusal to react while emotionally flooded, time pauses. But over time, those pauses begin rebuilding your entire nervous system. You stop becoming a prisoner of emotional research. You stop having extreme control over your internal state. You stop reacting like a wounded animal every time life gets difficult. And slowly, almost invisibly, you become someone far more dangerous. A person who cannot easily be provoked. And that is the deeper purpose of the pause. It is not simply about staying calm. It is about reclaiming the freedom to choose who you become in difficult moments. Viktor Frankl understood this better than almost anyone in modern history. After surviving Nazi concentration camps, after witnessing suffering that most human beings cannot even imagine, Frankl wrote one of the most important psychological insights ever recorded. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl was not technically a Stoic philosopher, but he arrived at the exact same truth the Stoics had discovered nearly 2,000 years earlier. The pause is power. That tiny invisible gap between what happens to you and what you choose to do next, that is where your freedom lives. Most people never notice it because they are trapped inside automatic reaction. But the Stoics trained themselves to live inside that space consciously. And modern research now confirms why this matters so much. A study from the University of Toronto examined how people were perceived during moments of conflict. Researchers found that individuals who practiced brief deliberate pauses before responding were consistently rated as more authoritative, more trustworthy, and more commanding than people who reacted immediately. Think about that for a moment. The pause did not make them appear weak. It did not make them appear passive. It made them appear powerful. Because there is something deeply unsettling and deeply impressive about a human being who refuses to be emotionally rushed. You have probably seen this yourself. Think about the people you genuinely admire under pressure. The ones who remain calm when everyone else becomes reactive. The ones who do not flinch emotionally. The ones who take a breath before speaking instead of instantly defending themselves. There is something magnetic about that quality. That visible moment of composure communicates something silently to everyone around them. This person is not controlled by circumstances. This person is controlled by themselves. And history gives us remarkable examples of this. One of the clearest was Cato the Younger, one of the final defenders of the Roman Republic, and one of the purest Stoics who ever lived. During the rise of Julius Caesar, while Rome slowly collapsed into dictatorship, most senators became terrified, corrupted, or emotionally reactive. Not Cato. Caesar mocked him publicly, tried bribing him, attempted to silence him, even sought to have him arrested. And yet Cato's response never became emotional chaos. He did not rant. He did not scream across the Senate chamber. He did not lose control publicly. He spoke calmly, quietly, deliberately, and somehow, that calmness became more dangerous than rage ever could have been. In fact, Historical accounts suggest Caesar feared Cato's moral authority more than many military threats. Why? Because Cato never surrendered the one thing Caesar was trying to steal from him: his self-possession, his composure, his credibility, his inner authority. And once a person protects those things, external attacks lose enormous power. That is why the next time someone disrespects you, your first response should not be speaking. Your first response should be breathing. Not theatrically, not as a performance, not as some fake power tactic. Actually breathe. Allow the first emotional wave to rise and pass through your body instead of instantly obeying it, because emotions are like waves in the ocean. If you react at the peak of the wave, you are no longer thinking clearly. But underneath the turbulence, deeper water always exists. The Stoics trained themselves to answer from the deeper water, and that pause is not weakness. It is the activation of the highest human faculty you possess, your rational mind, the part of you capable of choice instead of reflex, wisdom instead of impulse, clarity instead of emotional surrender. The Stoics believed this rational faculty was humanity's greatest gift, and most people waste it constantly by reacting before they think. Which brings us to the third rule: examine yourself first. The courage of honest self-reflection. There is an old story about Diogenes the Cynic, a philosopher whose ideas deeply influenced early Stoicism. One day, a man approached Diogenes furious with anger. Someone had insulted him publicly, called him foolish, ignorant, vain. The man expected sympathy, validation, outrage. Instead, Diogenes listened quietly and asked a single devastating question: is there any truth in what they said? The man became even angrier instantly, because like most people, he did not actually want self-examination. He wanted emotional reinforcement. He wanted someone to confirm that he was entirely innocent and the other person entirely wrong. But Diogenes cut straight to the only question that truly mattered. Is there truth in the criticism? That question sits at the center of Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius returned to it constantly in Meditations. Again and again, he examined himself with relentless honesty. What am I actually doing? What am I actually thinking? Am I acting from virtue or fear? Am I responding to truth or wounded pride? This practice had a name in Stoicism: prosoc, attention, not casual attention, not occasional reflection, vigilant, disciplined, daily awareness of the quality of your own thoughts, motives, and actions. Because the Stoics believe something extremely important: you cannot improve what you refuse to examine. And contrary to what many people assume, self-examination was never meant to be self-punishment. It was not about shame. It was not about self-hatred. It was an act of self-respect. A person who genuinely values their own potential becomes willing to examine themselves honestly. And there may be no better historical example of this than Epictetus. Epictetus was born into slavery. He belonged to a man named Epictetus, a former slave who later became secretary to Emperor Nero. According to several historical accounts, Epictetus deliberately broke Epictetus' leg as an act of cruelty and domination. Imagine the scene: a human being with absolutely no legal freedom, no protection, no power. And while the injury was happening, Epictetus reportedly said calmly, "You are going to break it." Then, when the leg finally snapped, he simply said, "Did I not tell you it would break?" That story has survived for nearly 2,000 years for a reason. Not because Epictetus could not feel pain, not because he was emotionless, not because he was superhuman, but because he had examined himself so deeply that he knew exactly what belonged to him internally and what did not. His body could be harmed. His status could be stripped away. His circumstances could become brutal. But his judgments, his values, his choices, his responses, those remained his. And once a person understands that distinction clearly, something extraordinary begins happening psychologically. They stop confusing external events with internal identity, which means when criticism arrives, they do not instantly collapse or react defensively. Instead, they examine it honestly. Is there truth here? Is there something I need to improve? Or is this merely another person projecting their own chaos outward? That is real self-possession. Not pretending criticism never hurts. Not becoming emotionally numb. But becoming honest enough to examine yourself without being destroyed by what you find. Because the Stoics understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. A person willing to confront themselves honestly becomes almost impossible to manipulate. And that is the real foundation of Stoic strength. Once you understand what truly belongs to you internally, the outside world loses much of its power to wound you. Epictetus understood this with extraordinary clarity. His body could be harmed. His freedom could be taken. His circumstances could become brutal beyond imagination. But the core of who he was, his judgments, his values, his response to suffering, remained untouchable because those things existed internally, beyond the reach of anyone else. And this leads us into the harder part of Rule 3, the part most people avoid. The next time someone disrespects you, before you rush to defend yourself emotionally, ask 2 difficult questions. The first question is this: is there any grain of truth in what they said? Not whether they delivered it kindly. They probably did not. Not whether they had the right to say it. Maybe they did not. And certainly not whether the disrespect itself was acceptable. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than that. Is there any actual truth hidden inside the criticism? Because sometimes there is. And the Stoics believe something that modern people often resist deeply. If criticism contains truth, rejecting it simply because it arrived rudely means your ego is becoming more important than your growth. That is dangerous. Imagine someone criticizes your impatience harshly, or your arrogance, or your inconsistency, or your tendency to interrupt others. Maybe they express it cruelly, maybe emotionally, maybe unfairly. But buried underneath the emotional delivery, there may still be information that could genuinely improve your life. The Stoics would say your responsibility is to extract the truth without absorbing the poison. Take the lesson, leave the bitterness, because your growth matters more than protecting your pride. Always. And then comes the second question: did I contribute anything to this situation? Notice carefully what this does not mean. It does not mean blaming yourself for another person's behavior. It does not mean excusing disrespect. It does not mean becoming passive or weak. It simply means becoming honest. Was there anything in your communication, your actions, your energy, your choices, or your lack of awareness that helped create the conditions for this conflict? If the answer is yes, that is valuable information. Most people never access that information because they are too busy protecting their self-image. They become so obsessed with proving they are innocent that they stop learning entirely. But the Stoics cared more about truth and comfort, even when truth hurt. There is a powerful historical example of this in the life of Cato the Elder, the great-grandfather of Cato the Younger. Cato the Elder practiced a form of nightly self-examination every evening before sleep. He would mentally review his entire day carefully, every conversation, every decision, every emotional reaction, every moment where he failed to live up to his own standards. Not to torture himself, to improve himself. This practice became known as the examined life, inspired by Socrates' famous idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. Think about the discipline required for that. Most people spend years avoiding themselves internally, distracting themselves, escaping reflection, defending every flaw automatically. Cato did the opposite. He looked directly at himself every single day with ruthless honesty. And because of that, he became incredibly difficult to damage emotionally from the outside. Why? Because he had already examined himself internally first. If there was weakness, he knew it. If there was arrogance, he saw it. If there was failure, he addressed it. So when criticism came from others, it rarely surprised him. That is one of the hidden powers of self-examination. The more honestly you confront yourself privately, the less power public criticism has over you. Because nothing destabilizes people more than hearing truths they are desperately trying to avoid. Cato the Elder lived into his 90s, remaining mentally sharp, productive, and morally respected until the end of his life. Not because he was perfect, because he was relentlessly honest. And honesty creates internal stability. So after any moment of disrespect, before you completely reject it or completely absorb it, spend 5 quiet minutes with what we might call the Stoic mirror, not asking, "Did I deserve disrespect?" No human being deserves cruelty. Instead ask, "Is there any truth, lesson, or information hidden inside this experience that could strengthen me?" That extraction becomes your gain. And everything else, the rudeness, the ignorance, the malice, the emotional projection, you leave behind. That is wisdom. And it leads directly into Rule 4. Control what is yours. This single Stoic principle has probably saved more sanity, more relationships, more careers, and more lives than almost any other philosophical idea ever developed. The dichotomy of control. The realization that every single thing in existence falls into one of only 2 categories. What is within your control, and what is not? Epictetus explained it simply. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. What is up to us? Our opinions, our desires, our actions, our judgments, our choices. What is not up to us? Our reputation, other people's opinions, external events, circumstances, outcomes. At first, this sounds almost too simple, but in practice, it changes everything. Because most people spend the majority of their emotional lives obsessing over things they fundamentally cannot control. Whether a coworker respects them, whether their boss appreciates their effort, whether their partner validates them, whether strangers online agree with them, whether people at social gatherings admire them, whether someone responds to a message quickly enough. And the tragic part is this: none of those things belong to you. Not truly. You can influence them sometimes. You can attempt to improve them, but you cannot fully control them. And whenever you emotionally attach your peace to uncontrollable things, suffering becomes inevitable. That is why people feel exhausted constantly. They are trying to control minds that are not theirs, opinions that are not theirs, outcomes that are not theirs. The Stoics believed this was one of the greatest forms of self-destruction, because every ounce of energy poured into uncontrollable things is energy stolen from the only place where real power exists. Your inner world. What actually belongs to you. Your thoughts, your values, your effort, your discipline, your integrity, your choices, your character. That is the complete list. And here is the extraordinary part. Once you fully accept that, life becomes dramatically lighter, because suddenly you stop chasing impossible emotional control over the external world. You stop begging for approval. You stop collapsing over rejection. You stop trying to force people to see your worth. Instead, your energy returns inward, toward discipline, toward clarity, toward self-respect, toward becoming someone stronger regardless of what the outside world chooses to do. And that is where genuine freedom begins. And this is where Stoicism becomes truly powerful, because once you understand what is actually yours to control, the noise of the world starts losing its grip on you. That small list, your thoughts, your values, your choices, your actions, may seem limited at first glance, but in reality, it contains everything that has ever truly mattered. Every great achievement in human history was created by someone who focused relentlessly on that inner territory while releasing everything outside of it. Let me tell you about Admiral James Stockdale. James Stockdale was the highest-ranking United States military officer held prisoner in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. In 1965, his plane was shot down over North Vietnam. He was captured, imprisoned, tortured repeatedly, isolated for years, humiliated publicly, and deprived of nearly every comfort a human being can lose. For 7.5 years, he lived inside conditions most people cannot even imagine enduring for a single month. But Stockdale was not entering that prison mentally unprepared. He had studied Stoic philosophy deeply, especially the teachings of Epictetus. While attending Stanford years earlier, he had encountered the Enchiridion, and those ideas became the psychological framework that would later save his life. Inside that prison, he drew a line with extraordinary clarity. On one side were the things he could not control: the torture, the isolation, the interrogations, the uncertainty, the physical suffering, the humiliation, the possibility that he might never see his family again. None of those things belonged to him. But on the other side of the line were the things that did. His interpretation of suffering, his integrity, his loyalty to his fellow prisoners, his response to fear, his refusal to surrender his internal freedom. That territory remained entirely his. And that distinction changed everything. Instead of merely trying to survive quietly, Stockdale chose to lead. He organized fellow prisoners into a system of resistance. Through tapped codes on prison walls, they communicated secretly between cells. They supported each other psychologically. They created order inside chaos. And perhaps most importantly, Stockdale refused to participate in propaganda broadcasts for the North Vietnamese, even when brutal torture followed. Why? Because pain could touch his body. But he refused to let it control his character. That was the line. He accepted physical consequences. He did not surrender psychological sovereignty. And when he was finally released in 1973, he walked off the plane under his own power, broken physically in many ways, but internally unbroken. Later, he wrote a remarkable book titled Courage Under Fire, testing Epictetus doctrines in a laboratory of human behavior. Even the title tells you everything. For Stockdale, Stoicism was not abstract philosophy. It was survival. It was structure. It was sanity. He said plainly that Epictetus helped save his life. Now bring this back to your own life. Bring it back to moments of disrespect. The insult itself is not yours. The tone of voice is not yours. The other person's behavior is not yours. Their opinion is not yours. Their emotional immaturity is not yours. It never was. And yet most people spend enormous amounts of emotional energy trying to control those things anyway, trying to force apologies, trying to change how witnesses perceive the situation, trying to rewrite the narrative afterward, trying to make everyone understand their side perfectly. All understandable, but all attempts to govern territory that was never theirs to govern. The Stoics would say this is why so many people remain trapped emotionally for years after moments of humiliation, because they keep fighting for control over something fundamentally uncontrollable. So what actually belongs to you? Your response, your interpretation, your next action, your values, your decision about whether this moment defines you or develops you, your choice about whether to confront directly or quietly let your actions speak over time. That is your territory. And once you fully internalize this, something profound happens. You stop seeing yourself as a victim. Victims define themselves primarily by what happened to them. Agents define themselves by how they responded. That is one of the deepest shifts in Stoic philosophy. The Stoics were agents even in chains, agents in exile, agents under persecution, agents facing death, because they understood that external freedom and internal freedom are not the same thing. A person can lose external power and still remain internally sovereign, and another person can possess wealth, status, influence, and still live completely enslaved to circumstances and opinions. So from now on, whenever disrespect enters your life, pause and mentally draw the line immediately. Ask yourself, what belongs to me here? My response, my values, my next decision, my composure, my integrity. Then ask, what does not belong to me? Their emotions, their opinion, their behavior, their approval, their narrative. And then do something most people never learn to do. Give all your energy to what is yours. Give none to what is not. That is freedom. And it leads directly into Rule 5. See through the performance. Understand disrespect for what it often truly is. Weakness disguised as power. In the 2nd century BC, Rome produced one of the greatest military commanders in history, Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal and effectively ended the Second Punic War. His victories saved Rome itself. He was brilliant, disciplined, fearless in battle, and respected by soldiers across the empire. And yet, when he returned home after those victories, he did not receive universal admiration. Instead, he faced jealousy. Political enemies attacked him relentlessly. They mocked him publicly. They accused him of arrogance. They dragged him into legal accusations and public humiliation. Ironically, One of the leading voices against him was Cato the Elder. Think about how absurd this was. A man who had defended Rome from destruction was now being attacked by people who had never stood where he stood, never faced what he faced, never sacrificed what he sacrificed. And during one particularly hostile public hearing, Scipio did something extraordinary. Instead of defending himself endlessly, instead of arguing emotionally, instead of begging the crowd for approval, he simply stood up and addressed the people calmly. "Today is the anniversary of the day I defeated Hannibal. Let us go to the temples and give thanks to the gods." Then he walked out, and the crowd followed him. That moment matters deeply, because Scipio understood something timeless. People who constantly try to diminish others are often revealing their own insecurity, envy, weakness, or hunger for power. Disrespect frequently performs confidence, while secretly exposing fragility. The Stoics understood this clearly. A secure person rarely needs to humiliate others. A disciplined person rarely needs to dominate conversations. A fulfilled person rarely obsesses over tearing people down publicly. So when someone disrespects you, learn to look beneath the surface performance. Very often, what appears to be strength is actually instability wearing armor. And once you begin to see through the performance, disrespect stops looking intimidating and starts looking revealing. This is Rule 5, and it requires a shift in perception that changes the entire emotional weight of these moments. Because the person attacking you is almost always far less powerful than their attack wants you to believe. Think about that carefully. When someone genuinely disrespects you, not constructive criticism, not honest disagreement, but deliberate humiliation, mockery, belittling, they are usually performing a very specific psychological function. They are managing their own inadequacy. That is the hidden engine behind most interpersonal cruelty. Not confidence, not superiority, not real strength, fear, insecurity, inner weakness looking for somewhere to escape. The psychologist Alfred Adler, whose work later shaped much of modern cognitive therapy, spent years documenting what he called the inferiority complex, and what he discovered was profound. Many of the most aggressive, domineering, and disrespectful people are not expressing power. They are compensating for the absence of it. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most secure. The person most desperate to diminish you is rarely the person most at peace with themselves. Real confidence usually does not need performance. It does not need domination. It does not need humiliation. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. In Meditations, he describes a fascinating mental exercise. Whenever you encounter someone who appears threatening, arrogant, or overpowering, imagine them in ordinary private moments, eating alone, sleeping, worrying about their health, afraid at night, aging, doubting themselves, sitting quietly with anxieties they never show the world. Subtract your judgment of them, Marcus wrote, and the magnificent spectacle that frightens so many people disappears. That line is powerful because it strips away illusion. This is not about dismissing people carelessly. It is about seeing accurately. The person disrespecting you is not demonstrating greatness in that moment. They are demonstrating limitation. Their inability to disagree respectfully. Their inability to regulate frustration. Their inability to engage with another human being as an equal. And once you see that clearly, the emotional spell begins to break. There is a documented story about Theodore Roosevelt that captures this perfectly. Long before becoming president, Roosevelt spent years ranching in the Dakota Badlands during the 1880s. During that time, he became deeply influenced by Stoic ideas, especially the writings of Marcus Aurelius. One evening inside a saloon, a local bully decided Roosevelt would make an easy target. The man pointed 2 guns at him and mocked him publicly, calling him 4 eyes because of his glasses. The entire scene was designed as theater. Intimidation, humiliation, dominance. Now notice something important. Roosevelt did not react immediately from panic, and he did not react blindly from rage. First, he studied the man. He assessed the situation calmly. Then he struck him 3 times and knocked him unconscious. Now, this is not an endorsement of violence. That is not the point of the story. The point is Roosevelt's perception before action. He saw through the performance. He recognized that the aggression depended entirely on fear, on audience reaction, on psychological submission. The bully's display of power was actually exposing the limits of his power, because performances like that require cooperation. They require the target to shrink. They require emotional surrender. They require fear. Remove those conditions, and the performance collapses. And this applies far beyond physical confrontation. Most disrespect operates the same way. The sarcastic coworker, the condescending relative, the online critic desperate for attention, the person who interrupts constantly to feel important. Look carefully, and you will often find insecurity beneath the surface. A person struggling to feel significant. A person trying to borrow power through intimidation. A person attempting to regulate internal discomfort by projecting it outward. The next time someone disrespects you, try something different. Instead of immediately feeling smaller, become curious. Ask yourself, what fear is operating here? What insecurity? What inner discomfort is driving this behavior? You do not need to say it out loud. You do not need to feel morally superior. Just see it clearly, because accuracy is power. And what you truly understand loses much of its ability to frighten you. That brings us to Rule 6. Cultivate virtue as your armor. Because ultimately, the Stoics believed the strongest protection against insult was not cleverness, aggression, or dominance. It was character. In 399 BC, Socrates stood trial in Athens. He was accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods of the city. But beneath those charges was something much simpler and far more dangerous. Socrates taught people to think independently. He asked uncomfortable questions. He challenged assumptions. He exposed hypocrisy. And for that, Athens decided he should die. At the time of the trial, Socrates was 70 years old. He had served Athens faithfully throughout his life, both in war and philosophy. Yet now the city he had devoted himself to wanted him executed. His friends arranged an escape plan. The guards had been bribed. A ship was prepared. Everything was ready. All Socrates had to do was leave. But he refused. Imagine the calm strength required for that moment. Sitting inside a prison cell with death approaching, and still refusing to betray your principles. Socrates explained patiently that he had spent his entire life teaching respect for law, civic responsibility, and moral integrity. To escape now would mean becoming someone different from the person he had spent decades building. And to him, that was worse than death itself. Who he was mattered more than whether he survived. The jury sentenced him to death, and Socrates accepted it. He drank the hemlock calmly, not bitter, not panicked, not broken. He spent his final hours still teaching, still discussing philosophy, still engaging thoughtfully with friends around him. Even at the edge of death, he remained fully himself. That is what the Stoics admired. Not invulnerability, not perfection, integrity. A person whose inner character remains stable regardless of external pressure. And that is the deeper lesson here. When your identity is built on reputation, praise, status, approval, or external validation, disrespect will always wound you deeply because your sense of self depends on forces outside your control. But when your identity is rooted in virtue, honesty, discipline, courage, wisdom, composure, then insults begin losing their power. Because another person cannot truly damage qualities they do not control. That is why virtue becomes armor. Not armor that blocks pain completely, but armor that prevents pain from defining you. And this is where the Stoics take the idea even further, because true protection from disrespect was never just emotional control. It was character. The Stoics admired Socrates almost like a sacred figure, not because he was perfect, not because he avoided suffering, but because at the moment when everything external was stripped away, reputation, safety, even life itself, he remained completely aligned with his principles. To the Stoics, his death was not a tragedy in the ordinary sense. It was proof that virtue itself is the highest form of strength. Proof that a person living in complete alignment with their values becomes, in the deepest possible way, impossible to destroy. Because real destruction only happens when someone loses what matters most to them. And if what matters most is your character, your integrity, your inner life, then no insult, no humiliation, no public attack can truly take that away. Seneca wrote something remarkable about this. A man's virtue ought not to be measured by his extraordinary exertions, but by his everyday conduct. That line matters because most people imagine strength as something dramatic, a heroic speech, a perfect response under pressure, a single defining moment. But the Stoics saw it differently. Virtue is not armor you suddenly put on during battle. It is armor built slowly, quietly, repeatedly, decision by decision, habit by habit, ordinary moment by ordinary moment. So when the difficult moment finally arrives, you are not scrambling to become strong. You already are. Think about that carefully. Every time you keep your word when it would be easier not to, you lay another layer of armor. Every time you act honestly when deception would benefit you, another layer. Every time you stay calm under pressure, treat someone with dignity, finish difficult work, speak truthfully, control your impulses, you strengthen something internal that the outside world cannot easily penetrate. This is what the Stoics meant by becoming untouchable. Not physically untouchable, not emotionally numb, structurally solid. So what does this mean practically in your own life? It means the best long-term protection against disrespect is not developing thicker skin. It is developing a cleaner conscience, a stronger character, a tighter alignment between what you claim to value and how you actually behave. Because when your behavior is genuinely rooted in integrity, insults lose much of their ability to attach themselves to you. If you are truly honest, accusations of dishonesty slide off more easily. If you are genuinely disciplined, lazy criticism loses force. If you consistently act with dignity, disrespect struggles to find somewhere to land. Why? Because accusations need contradiction to survive. They need weakness they can attach themselves to. And when the underlying reality is solid, the attack simply cannot grip deeply. Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example of this. During his presidency, he was attacked relentlessly. Newspapers mocked him constantly. He was called a buffoon, an ape, a country fool, a tyrant, a coward, a monster, a saint, sometimes by the same publication in the same week. The disrespect aimed at Lincoln was constant, vicious, and often deeply personal. But Lincoln rarely centered his life around defending himself emotionally against every insult. Instead, he returned over and over to a much simpler question. Am I acting rightly? That was his compass. Not popularity, not public approval, not emotional retaliation. He kept his attention fixed on his own moral direction, while criticism swirled around him like a storm. And perhaps the clearest evidence of his character came from Frederick Douglass. Douglass met Lincoln multiple times and later wrote something extraordinary. He said Lincoln was the first white man he had ever met who did not make him feel conscious of his race in any way. Lincoln treated him simply as another human being. That kind of quiet decency cannot be manufactured for appearances. It has to be lived daily. And because it was real, because it was structural, political attacks could not erase it. This leads to an uncomfortable but necessary exercise. Audit your life honestly. Look carefully at the gaps between who you say you are and how you actually behave. Where are you inconsistent? Where do your actions betray your stated values? Where do you secretly know you are out of alignment? Because every gap becomes an opening. Every inconsistency becomes a place where criticism hurts more deeply. Not because the critic is powerful, but because part of you knows there is truth inside the wound. Close those gaps. Not for reputation, not for image, not so people praise you. For armor. Because every closure strengthens your internal foundation, and that foundation cannot be taken away by another person's opinion. Now this brings us naturally into Rule 7. Practice empathy like a strategist, not a pushover. Because many people misunderstand empathy completely. There is a weak version of empathy. The version where you abandon your own needs to keep everyone comfortable. The version where understanding becomes submission. The version where you absorb everyone else's emotions until you are exhausted, overwhelmed, and directionless. That is not Stoic empathy. Stoic empathy is something much more disciplined. It begins with a simple recognition. Human beings share a common rational nature. Marcus Aurelius described this beautifully. He wrote that humans are made for cooperation the same way feet, hands, eyelids, and rows of teeth are designed to work together. In other words, harming another person ultimately damages the larger human system you are part of. And understanding another person helps you understand yourself more clearly. But remember who Marcus Aurelius was. He was not living isolated from the world. He ruled an empire, managed armies, handled betrayal, negotiated political conflict, administered justice. His empathy was never passive. It was strategic. He sought to understand people's motivations, not to excuse destructive behavior, but to respond more intelligently to it. That distinction changes everything. Because when you understand why someone behaves a certain way, you become harder to manipulate emotionally. You stop reacting blindly. You begin seeing patterns: fear, envy, insecurity, need for control, need for validation. Suddenly disrespect stops feeling random. And once behavior becomes understandable, it also becomes less intimidating. The Stoic does not practice empathy to become weaker. The Stoic practices empathy to see more clearly. And clear vision is one of the greatest forms of power a human being can possess. And this is where Stoicism becomes even more powerful, because empathy, in the Stoic sense, is not emotional surrender. It is strategic clarity. The Stoic version of empathy does not say, "I understand your pain, therefore I must excuse your behavior." That is not what Marcus Aurelius meant. That is not what Epictetus taught. Stoic empathy says something far more disciplined. I understand what is driving your behavior, and because I understand it, I can respond intelligently instead of reacting emotionally. That difference changes everything. Because the moment you understand another person clearly, you stop becoming trapped inside their provocation. You stop reacting blindly. And instead, you begin operating from your own values. Let me give you one of the clearest historical examples of this. In the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln appointed Edwin Stanton as his Secretary of War during the American Civil War. But before Stanton ever respected Lincoln, he openly despised him. He mocked Lincoln publicly, called him a guerrilla, insulted his appearance, dismissed his intelligence, and Lincoln knew about all of it. Imagine that. A man publicly humiliating you while the entire political world watches. Most leaders would have retaliated, excluded him, punished him, protected their ego. Lincoln did something different. He studied Stanton. He looked beneath the insults and saw the actual man. He recognized that Stanton's arrogance came partly from genuine brilliance. Stanton was exceptionally skilled at military organization and administration. Lincoln also understood something else. Stanton's harshness was driven by intense duty, impatience, and frustration toward anything he perceived as incompetence. In other words, Lincoln understood the engine beneath the behavior, and instead of reacting emotionally to Stanton's contempt, Lincoln engaged him strategically, patiently, calmly, intelligently. Over time, Stanton realized that Lincoln's quiet demeanor was not weakness. It was depth. It was restraint. It was strategic intelligence disguised as simplicity. And by the end of the Civil War, the relationship had transformed completely. When Lincoln was assassinated, Stanton stood beside his deathbed. And it was Stanton, the same man who once mocked him publicly, who spoke the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." Think about that transformation carefully. Lincoln did not win Stanton over through emotional retaliation. He won through understanding. That is Stoic empathy. Not weakness. Not passivity. Clarity used intelligently. And this matters deeply when dealing with disrespect. Because when someone insults you, and you pause long enough to genuinely ask what might be driving their behavior, fear, insecurity, envy, anxiety, cultural conditioning, wounded pride, something important happens immediately. First, you stop personalizing the attack so deeply, and that alone reduces much of its emotional power. Second, you gain strategic information. You begin seeing how to respond in ways that might actually shift the dynamic instead of simply escalating conflict. This is why Stoic empathy is not about being nice. It is about being effective. It keeps you connected to the rational part of your mind instead of letting raw emotion take over. Modern neuroscience would describe this as staying connected to the prefrontal cortex rather than surrendering entirely to the amygdala. The Stoics understood this long before brain scans existed. A reactive mind becomes predictable. A clear mind becomes powerful. So the next time you encounter disrespect, try something simple. Before reacting, spend 30 seconds imagining what the world might look like from inside that person's mind. Not to excuse them. Not to absorb their negativity. Not to surrender your boundaries. Just to understand them clearly enough that your response comes from composure instead of chaos. Because 30 seconds of genuine understanding is usually worth far more than an hour spent mentally rehearsing angry comebacks. And this leads directly into Rule 8. Set boundaries from strength, not anger. There is a dangerous misunderstanding about Stoicism that destroys the philosophy completely if people believe it. The misunderstanding goes like this. Stoicism teaches acceptance, therefore Stoics should tolerate everything silently. That is completely wrong. Historically wrong. Philosophically wrong. Practically wrong. The Stoics did not teach weakness. They taught disciplined response. Cato the Younger is one of the clearest examples of this. He was arguably the purest Stoic of the Roman Republican era. And he absolutely did not sit quietly while Rome collapsed around him. When Julius Caesar began consolidating power and threatening the Roman Republic, Cato resisted him fiercely. He delivered long speeches in the Senate. He fought politically for hours at a time. He opposed what he believed was corruption openly and consistently. At one point, Caesar even offered him a pardon. Cato refused. Why? Because accepting the pardon would have meant symbolically accepting Caesar's authority over him, and that violated his principles. Now here is the important part. Cato lost. Caesar rose to power anyway. But the Stoics never measured virtue purely by external victory. Cato's resistance itself was the point. His refusal to betray his values under pressure was what made him deeply Stoic. The same pattern appears again with Epictetus. Remember, Epictetus had been enslaved, tortured, humiliated physically. Yet he never taught passive submission. He did not tell people to quietly accept mistreatment forever. He taught something far more demanding. Respond from your values, not from your wounds. That is a completely different instruction. Because when boundaries come from anger, they are unstable. They become emotional explosions, revenge attempts, ego protection. But when boundaries come from values, they become calm, deliberate, and powerful. The Stoic approach to boundaries is not, "You hurt me, so now I react emotionally." It is, "This behavior violates my principles, my standards, or my dignity, and therefore I will respond clearly and appropriately." That distinction matters enormously. A person reacting from wounds usually loses control. A person responding from values usually gains it. And people can feel that difference immediately. One feels chaotic, the other feels immovable. And this is where Stoicism becomes even more disciplined, because once you understand your values clearly, you stop reacting emotionally and start standing firmly. A boundary drawn from self-knowledge feels completely different from a boundary drawn from anger, and people can feel that difference immediately. A boundary created from anger usually sounds like this: "You hurt me, and now I need you to understand my pain." It is reactive, emotionally charged, focused entirely on the other person's behavior, and because it comes from emotional flooding, it often becomes exaggerated, messy, or inconsistent. It depends on the other person responding correctly in order to feel valid. But a boundary created from strength sounds very different. It says, "This is who I am. This is how I expect to be treated. I'm communicating that clearly and calmly because I know where I stand." Notice the difference. There is no desperation in it, no emotional chaos, no need for approval. The person setting the boundary is not trying to control anyone else. They are simply defining themselves. And paradoxically, that kind of boundary is much harder to argue with, because it is rooted in self-respect instead of self-defense. One of the greatest real-world examples of this came from Nelson Mandela during his imprisonment on Robben Island. For 27 years, Mandela was imprisoned under brutal conditions in apartheid South Africa. And among the countless humiliations forced upon prisoners, there was one detail that revealed everything about the system. Black prisoners were forced to wear shorts. White prisoners were allowed long trousers. The shorts were not about comfort. They were symbolic, a deliberate attempt to diminish dignity. Mandela refused, not violently, not dramatically. He simply refused to wear them. For 2 full years, he maintained that position despite punishment and pressure. Eventually, the prison authorities gave all prisoners long trousers. Now think carefully about what happened there. Mandela's boundary was not emotional rebellion. It was disciplined dignity. He did not scream. He did not collapse into hatred. He communicated his standard clearly, and then held it consistently. That consistency changed the environment around him. And according to many historical accounts, even some of the guards eventually began respecting him deeply. Some who initially viewed him as an enemy later saw him almost as a friend. Why? Because Mandela remained the same with everyone. The same calm, the same courtesy, the same refusal to surrender his humanity. That is true strength. And this reveals an important distinction. Most people build walls. Stoics become rocks. A wall is defensive, reactive, built from fear. Its entire purpose is to keep people out. But a rock does not defend itself emotionally. It simply is what it is. It does not reshape itself every time pressure is applied. And over time, the rock shapes the environment around it instead of being shaped by it. That is how real boundaries work. Not emotional explosions. Not passive silence. Clear standards consistently maintained. So here is a practical exercise. Identify your non-negotiables. The specific ways you refuse to be treated. Disrespect, dishonesty, manipulation, public humiliation, repeated violations of trust. Whatever they are, define them clearly. Write them down if necessary. And when those lines are crossed, address them once. Clearly, calmly, without drama, without apology. That's not how I'm willing to be spoken to. Let's continue this conversation differently. Simple, direct, grounded. Then hold the line. Not from ego, not from stubbornness, from clarity about who you are. And this leads naturally into Rule 9. Use humor as a scalpel, the philosopher's lightest weapon. This surprises many people when they first encounter Stoicism because they imagine Stoics as severe, emotionally rigid people. But Seneca, one of the greatest Stoic writers, had a subtle wit running through many of his letters. In the middle of serious philosophical reflections, he would suddenly insert quiet humor, almost like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. At one point he wrote, "It is better to know some of the questions than all of the answers." There is humility in that. Perspective, lightness. The Stoics understood something important about humor. Not all humor is equal. There is humor used to humiliate others, humor used to dominate, humor used to hide insecurity. But there is another kind entirely, the kind the Stoics valued. Humor rooted in perspective. The quiet amusement of someone who understands how absurd life can sometimes be, especially when they themselves are involved. That kind of humor is powerful because it breaks the illusion that every embarrassing moment is catastrophic. It interrupts self-importance. Think about it. Most disrespect only becomes emotionally devastating because we unconsciously magnify it. We turn one awkward moment into a permanent identity. One criticism becomes a personal collapse. One embarrassing interaction becomes a story we replay for years. Humor interrupts that spiral. It allows you to step slightly outside the moment and see it differently. Not dismissively, not carelessly, but with perspective. The Stoic sense of humor says, yes, this situation is uncomfortable, but it is also deeply human. And there is strength in that realization. Because the person who can laugh gently at themselves becomes incredibly difficult to humiliate. Humiliation requires total emotional identification with the moment. Humor creates distance. It loosens the grip. A person who can smile calmly at minor embarrassment sends a powerful signal to everyone around them. You cannot control me through shame. That is why humor, used correctly, becomes a kind of philosophical weapon. Light, precise, controlled, not a hammer, a scalpel. And this is where Stoicism becomes transformational, because once you stop feeding resentment, you begin reclaiming the energy that was quietly draining your entire life. Every moment you remain trapped in anger costs you something. Not metaphorically, literally. Your mental and emotional resources are finite. Your attention, your focus, your creativity, your peace, your ability to build a meaningful future. And every time you replay an insult, rehearse revenge, or mentally relive disrespect, you are spending those resources on someone who has already taken enough from you. Seneca once wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" And modern science confirms exactly what the Stoics intuited thousands of years ago. Chronic resentment changes the body. Sustained anger elevates cortisol and adrenaline over long periods of time. Elevated cortisol damages memory, weakens the immune system, accelerates aging, disrupts sleep, narrows cognitive flexibility. In other words, resentment is biologically expensive. It slowly reshapes your body around stress, while the person you resent may have already moved on completely. Think about how strange that is. Someone insults you once, and then you continue insulting yourself internally for months afterward by carrying them inside your mind. That famous phrase often attributed to Buddha captures it perfectly. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The Stoics understood this deeply, which is why forgiveness to them was never sentimental. It was strategic self-preservation. One of the greatest examples of this came after the American Civil War. When the war finally ended, General Ulysses S. Grant met Confederate General Robert East Lee at Appomattox Courthouse to negotiate surrender. Now imagine the emotional atmosphere in that moment. Hundreds of thousands dead. Years of devastation. A nation shattered. Grant had every reason politically and personally to humiliate Lee publicly. Many leaders would have done exactly that. Instead, Grant surprised everyone. He allowed Confederate officers to keep their sidearms. He allowed soldiers to keep their horses so they could return home and work their farms. He refused to demand a humiliating surrender ceremony. He even arranged food rations for starving Confederate troops. Lee reportedly became emotional hearing the terms. One Confederate officer later called it the most generous act he had ever witnessed in war. Now ask yourself something important. Was Grant weak? Of course not. This was the same man who had prosecuted one of the harshest wars in American history with relentless determination. His forgiveness was not softness. It was strategic intelligence. Grant understood that humiliation creates future enemies. He recognized that the real decision was not between justice and mercy. It was between temporary emotional satisfaction and lasting peace. He chose the long game. That is Stoic forgiveness, not emotional surrender, not pretending harm never happened. A deliberate refusal to keep feeding destruction after the conflict has already ended. And your own life works the same way. No matter how painful your situation feels right now, the principle remains identical. When you release resentment, not because the other person deserves forgiveness, but because carrying the resentment is destroying your peace, you reclaim something priceless. Your energy, your focus, your future. You stop investing emotional capital into a wound that no longer deserves access to your life. That is why forgiveness is a decision before it is ever a feeling. Most people wait to feel peaceful before they let go. Stoicism reverses it. You decide first. You decide that this person no longer gets permanent residence inside your mind. You decide your mental space is too valuable to be occupied by bitterness. And then, slowly, the emotional peace follows the decision. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently. Repeat the decision as many times as necessary, because every repetition weakens resentment's grip. And this brings us naturally to Rule 11. Use disrespect as fuel. The Stoic alchemy. In 301 BC, a merchant ship traveling from Phoenicia sank in a violent storm near Greece. Everything was lost. The cargo, the crew, the accumulated wealth of the merchant aboard. His livelihood disappeared in a single afternoon. That merchant's name was Zeno of Citium, the man who would later found Stoicism itself. Now pause for a moment and imagine the psychological impact of that disaster. One day you are successful, respected, financially secure. The next day you wash ashore with nothing except your life. Most people would interpret that as total ruin. Zeno did not. Within 20 years, he built one of the most influential philosophical schools in human history. A philosophy built around one central realization: external loss is not true loss. Because the only thing that truly belongs to you is your character, your reasoning, and your ability to choose your response. Zeno later understood something extraordinary about that shipwreck. It had stripped away everything false, everything temporary, everything he had mistakenly believed was essential. And what remained was still enough. More than enough. He was still alive, still thinking, still capable of rebuilding. The Stoics called this alchemy, the transformation of suffering into strength, humiliation into wisdom, loss into clarity, disrespect into fuel. And this changes everything about how you view difficult experiences. Because most people experience pain passively, the Stoics processed pain actively. They asked, "How can this sharpen me? How can this refine me? What can this build inside me that comfort never could?" That question alone changes the entire direction of your life. Because when you stop viewing disrespect as proof of weakness and start viewing it as training material, you become dangerous in the best possible sense. Every insult becomes information. Every setback becomes conditioning. Every humiliation becomes another opportunity to strengthen the parts of yourself that cannot be touched externally. And eventually something remarkable happens. The very experiences that once would have broken you become the experiences that built you. And this is where the Stoic philosophy reaches its deepest transformation, because eventually you stop asking only how to survive difficulty and begin asking how to use it. That is the difference. The Stoics never pretended pain was pleasant. They never denied suffering. They never asked people to fake positivity. Instead, they practiced something much harder. They asked, "What can this teach me? What strength is this forcing me to build? What truth is this revealing that comfort would have kept hidden?" That is Stoic alchemy, the transformation of suffering into wisdom. Seneca understood this personally. When Emperor Claudius exiled him to the island of Corsica, Seneca lost nearly everything that defined his public identity: his wealth, his status, his political influence, his connection to family and society. 8 years in isolation. Most people would have interpreted exile as humiliation. But Seneca used it differently. He wrote, and during those years of forced solitude, he produced some of the most enduring philosophical work in Western history. The exile gave him something comfort never could: silence, distance, clarity. He later wrote, "I was banished. Therefore I learned." Think about how radical that mindset is. Most people ask, "Why is this happening to me?" The Stoic asks, "What is this preparing me for?" Now apply this directly to disrespect. Imagine someone dismisses your idea publicly during a meeting. You immediately have two possible paths. The first path is the one most people unconsciously choose. You absorb the disrespect as proof of your inadequacy. You become quieter afterward, more hesitant, less willing to contribute. You begin shrinking yourself to avoid future embarrassment. That is one possible outcome. But there is another. You treat the experience as information instead of identity. You ask, "What made my idea easy to dismiss? Did I communicate it clearly enough? What relationship or credibility have I neglected that might have changed the room?" Notice the shift. The disrespect is no longer a wound. It becomes data, a research project. And research projects create growth. This is exactly how resilient people evolve, while reactive people remain trapped. Thomas Edison demonstrated this mindset in one of the most unbelievable moments of his life. In December of 1914, his laboratory complex caught fire. Millions of dollars worth of equipment and research were destroyed. A lifetime of work burned in front of him. His son Charles later described watching his father stare at the flames through the night. Most people would have collapsed emotionally. Edison didn't. Instead, he reportedly told his son, "Go get your mother and her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again." Think about the perspective required to say that while your life's work burns to the ground. The next morning, Edison returned to work. At 67 years old, he simply said, "I'm not too old to make a fresh start." That is Stoicism in action. The fire destroyed material. It did not destroy Edison, because he understood the ancient Stoic distinction between what can be taken externally and what remains internally untouchable. And eventually even catastrophe became fuel. Now bring that directly back to disrespect. The Stoic alchemist asks one central question. What can this make me? Not, how much did this hurt? Not, what does this say about the other person? But, what strength can I extract from this? Patience. Because difficult people force you to practice patience. Clarity about your own values. Because violations make your values visible. Emotional regulation. Because staying composed under pressure becomes easier every time you practice it. Strategic intelligence. Because learning why people behave the way they do gives you an advantage in every future interaction. Even confidence itself often grows this way. Not from praise. From surviving situations that once terrified you. So after any serious experience of disrespect, ask yourself two questions. What did this cost me? And then, what did this teach me? The cost matters. Acknowledge it honestly. But understand something important. The cost is already spent. You cannot recover it. The teaching, however, can continue compounding for the rest of your life. And this brings us to the final rule. Rule 12. Build an inner citadel. The ultimate Stoic defense. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea constantly throughout meditations. Again and again, he described what he called the inner citadel. A fortress inside the self. A place that external chaos cannot invade unless you surrender it willingly. That idea has echoed through 2,000 years of philosophy, psychology, military strategy, and human resilience because it captures something profoundly true. There is a place inside you that cannot be touched by external force. It can be abandoned. Yes, you can hand over the keys through self-pity, through emotional reactivity, through the habit of allowing every external event to determine your internal state. But it cannot be forcibly taken. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Now what exactly is the inner citadel? Concretely, it is everything you have built within yourself. Your values, your habits of thought, your emotional discipline, your understanding of what truly matters, your relationship with failure, your ability to exist without constant external validation, your capacity to remain steady in uncertainty. In other words, the inner citadel is all 11 previous rules integrated into a daily way of living. And like every real fortress in history, it is not built overnight. It is built stone by stone, choice by choice, reaction by reaction, long before the crisis arrives. Because eventually the siege always comes. Loss comes. Humiliation comes. Fear comes. Rejection comes. And when that moment arrives, you do not magically become strong. You simply discover what you have already built. Nothing more. Nothing less. One of the greatest examples of this inner citadel in human history was Harriet Tubman. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Tubman experienced brutal violence from childhood. She was beaten repeatedly, whipped, and at one point a heavy metal weight was thrown at her head, causing lifelong neurological episodes. And yet, despite all of that, something inside her remained unconquered. Something no external cruelty could fully reach. That was her citadel. And that inner fortress would eventually make her one of the most courageous human beings the world has ever known. And this is where the Stoic journey reaches its final form. Because eventually the goal is no longer simply surviving disrespect. The goal becomes building a self so internally grounded that external forces lose the power to define you. Harriet Tubman embodied that kind of strength. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Tubman grew up inside a system specifically designed to destroy human dignity. She watched family members sold away from her. She endured beatings, whippings, and physical trauma severe enough to affect her health for the rest of her life. Every condition around her justified despair. And yet she escaped. But that is not the most extraordinary part of her story. The extraordinary part is that she went back. Again, and again, and again. 19 separate times she returned to the South to guide enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. 19 journeys under constant threat of capture, torture, or death. And through all of it, she reportedly said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Think about the certainty in that statement. Not arrogance. Not theatrical confidence. Clarity. This was a woman legally considered property by the society around her. A fugitive hunted by armed men. A person operating under danger every single time she returned south. And yet, history records her not as frantic or reckless, but as calm, strategic, disciplined, and absolutely unwavering in purpose. That is the inner citadel fully constructed, not the absence of fear. Tubman almost certainly felt fear constantly. Anyone would. The difference was that fear no longer controlled her actions. Her purpose had become stronger than her fear. Her values had become stronger than her circumstances. And when a person reaches that point internally, they become impossible to contain psychologically. Not dangerous to ordinary people. Dangerous to systems built on fear and control. That is what Stoicism ultimately aims toward. Not emotional numbness. Internal sovereignty. Now the obvious question becomes, how do you build that kind of inner citadel for yourself? The answer is both simple and difficult. You build it the same way every fortress in history was built. Stone by stone. Daily. Quietly. Without applause. You begin with honest self-examination. Not to shame yourself. Not to obsess over flaws. But to see yourself clearly, because clarity is the beginning of all transformation. You read actively, not passively. Not consuming ideas for entertainment, but wrestling with ideas that challenge your assumptions and sharpen your thinking. You write, because writing forces thoughts into structure. Thoughts floating loosely in the mind often feel convincing until you try to place them clearly on paper. Writing reveals confusion. Writing creates precision. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius never intended meditations to become famous. It was simply the written architecture of a man building himself internally day by day. You meditate regularly on what matters, and what does not. On what belongs to your control, and what never did. You practice gratitude. Not performative gratitude. Not forced positivity. Real gratitude. A deliberate reorientation toward what remains good and meaningful in your life instead of constant fixation on what is missing. And perhaps most importantly, you voluntarily practice difficulty. Cold water. Hard conversations. Projects that intimidate you. The apology you keep postponing. The uncomfortable truth you avoid speaking. Not because suffering itself is noble. The Stoics never worshipped suffering. They understood something more practical. Voluntary difficulty builds capacity for involuntary difficulty. The ancient Stoics called this practice ascesis, training, conditioning the mind and character before hardship arrives. Because eventually hardship always arrives. And preparation changes everything. You also protect and cultivate your relationships carefully. The people around you become part of your citadel. Research from Yale sociologist Nicholas Christakis demonstrated that strong social relationships are among the most powerful predictors of resilience, health, and longevity. The Stoics would not have been surprised by this. Human beings are strengthened through meaningful connection. So choose relationships carefully. Choose people who challenge you toward growth. People who speak honestly. People who encourage your better nature instead of feeding your weaknesses. A builder selects stones carefully before constructing a fortress. You must do the same with the people closest to your life. And finally, every single day, you return to your values. Not as abstract philosophy, as concrete commitments. This is how I will behave today. This is how I will treat people today. This is the standard I refuse to abandon today. Because the inner citadel is not theory. It is repetition. Daily decisions repeated long enough that they become structure. Most people overlook ordinary moments because they seem insignificant. The Stoics knew ordinary moments are everything. The small reactions, the private choices, the unnoticed disciplines. Those become the stones. The stones become the walls. And eventually the walls become a fortress. No humiliation, no disrespect, and no external pressure can truly penetrate. That is why Rule 12 is not merely another technique. It is a complete way of life. And all 12 of these principles share one thing in common. They were not invented by motivational speakers. They were not created inside comfortable conference rooms. They were forged by people who faced exile, slavery, public humiliation, political persecution, war, torture, death, and who emerged from those experiences with something the world could not take from them: their character, their clarity, their unbreakable relationship with their own values. And you need to understand something clearly. You will absolutely be disrespected again. That is not pessimism. It is simply reality. As long as you are alive, visible, ambitious, and attempting meaningful things, some people will misunderstand you. Some will envy you. Some will dismiss you. Some will project their pain onto you. Some will be strangers. Some will be co-workers. Some may even be people you love. And every single time it happens, you will face the same choice. You can react emotionally. You can hand your peace over to whoever provoked you. You can shrink yourself, carry resentment, replay the moment endlessly. Or you can make the Stoic choice. The choice of the examined life, the inner citadel, the strategic mind, the alchemist's perspective. The choice that says, "This happened. It was real. And what I choose to become because of it belongs entirely to me." That is Stoicism. Not a life without pain. Not a life without difficulty. A life where pain becomes material instead of destiny. Where hardship becomes instruction instead of identity. Where what happens to you is never the final verdict, only the beginning of the story. And the person writing that story, shaping it, directing it, deciding what it ultimately means, is always you.